Hello, and thanks for checking out another video. Today, I'm going to do probably my worst review so far. I usually try and keep them short, to the point, and following a general guideline. And even though I have written notes on this, the book was just so massive and a little bit all over the place. If I have to give some candid opinion on it, that even with the notes that I'm going to look at here and there, I probably will need to cut this just to double check my sources and slice this up. So maybe not a one taker, but this is my review of Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens. So this next book from the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus is a book that I saw on a bunch of must-read lists, most excited for fall. Had to check it out. I added it to my queue and was able to get a hold from Libby, so I delved into this, even though I could not finish Sapiens. So let me get that out there now, that Sapiens, while interesting, was just not my cup of tea with the writing style. I just got lost. But having just done my master's in business analytics at NYU Stern, we took a lot of classes on AI, machine learning, algorithms. And this being 2024, AI is a hot topic in the business world in general. So all that backstory and this book being about AI and the way information spreads through the networks, I was actually interested this time in the subject. So that got me through this book, which admittedly is very long, could probably be better summarized. And I probably got most of the summary I needed from the New York Times review, which is very good. And to quote them in the review of Nexus is, in a nutshell, Harari's thesis is that the difference between democracies and dictatorships lies in how they handle information. Dictatorships are more concerned with controlling data than with testing its truth value. Democracies, by contrast, are transparent information networks in which citizens are able to evaluate and, if necessary, correct bad data. So that's, in a nutshell, from the New York Times review. And I really agree with it after reading and powering through the whole book, which was very long-winded. So the first half of Nexus is a study of why AI is fundamentally different. So what makes information networks and AI now so different from anything we've seen as a species before? So the book takes us on a journey of information networks, starting with clay tablets and how that, well, even before clay tablets, the oral tradition of passing down stories was mankind's first use of information technology, being able to transmit ideas between people or through an oral tradition, through oral history, which has then evolved into clay tablets and then through books. And then books, you needed someone to read the books, transcribe the books, and the books were the way information was transmitted between societies and between humans. And then we get to computers, which are the exponential growth of this information network and how information travels. And again, that's the thesis of the book, how information travels through the network, and with AI being fundamentally different because AI and, as a broader term, the algorithms and programs, not necessarily saying it's generative AI or thinking AI, just AI as a all-encompassing term. AI is now part of that transmission. So not only, there's no basically human in the loop, to quote Ethan Mollick's recent book that I also read, Co-Intelligence, to which he stresses the human in the loop. Nexus is almost the antithesis of that book, that it warns the dangers of not keeping the human in the loop. So back to this analogy of transmission of information, because the AI is part of the network itself and can decide what kind of to transmit and why to transmit, that's what makes it so different from how information was in the past. Instead of person to person or person to tablet to person, person to book to person for the way of transmitting information, even early internet, it was a human writing on a message board his ideas, writing a blog post, writing her article to share their videos on a YouTube video, and then the other human on the other end consuming the information. The AI is in that transmission loop, and the AI is making decisions and changing the information. It's creating its own information. It's writing stories. We know about AI generated content. So the AI being part of that network is what makes it fundamentally different and why we should be so concerned. So that was kind of the first half where Harari goes into this more historical account of that whole process and uses great examples. I enjoyed particularly the examples of bureaucracy, which I never really thought about, maybe because I'm not a history buff, but bureaucracy as a term, bureaucrats evolved from needing, and bureaucrat meaning like the bureau, meaning a chest of drawers. So the bureaucrats use these chests of drawers to categorize things. So the bureaucracy is the categorization of data, of information in a historical context, and that humans had to fit the data. So you had to conform to the form. If you've ever been in that situation, that there's not a checkbox for me in this specific form, you're conforming to the doctor's form of information, even though that might not be there. That's an example of a bureaucracy, of government bureaucracy, of how this is the way that a government or an organization is ordering things, and it's forcing humans to conform themselves to fit the natural order of things. Some other interesting ideas that I got from this first half was the Bible as blockchain. Just talk about that briefly. That was an interesting idea, again, of talking about how information flows between people, that in the old world where books weren't as free as they are now, you had to have someone to transcribe the book. And this, of course, introduced errors because the transcription could be wrong, or in an organization like the church, you could selectively leave out parts of the book that you didn't want to pass on. There's an example of early biblical texts like the story of Enoch, how that's not in the modern Bible, but it is in previous versions of Bibles. So how that is, selective, just, leaving out information. So where he gets this idea of Bible as blockchain was once the Bible spread and everyone had access to the Bible or biblical texts. He also uses the Jewish Bible as an example, that how disseminating the information so that everybody basically has a copy is much like blockchain. So that when future copies are made, since everybody knows about these sacred texts, that you can spot the information that's changed if you get a version of the book that has something different. So it's like a blockchain, it's self-correcting. And that's where he's getting at the earlier thesis of had the human in the loop and how the self-correcting mechanism is kind of the way forward. That's his thesis, that we must develop these self-correcting mechanisms as a check on information. And he uses that as other examples as well. The main example being the free press and of science, and how science institutions, through the publisher parish of a researcher where you must publish academic papers, but then there's also the body of science in general where you critique others' work, where you review your peers' papers, and you're encouraged to find new ways of doing things. Even though one of the examples was how it took a long time for this specific, research breakthrough to get accepted, but eventually did get accepted in the scientific community, and that changed. It shifted the way scientists thought about. I think it was about crystals. It was a little while since I read this book, and it was, again, a long book. So that's interesting to think of, again, about blockchain and self-correcting technology, such as science. And then his example of, he delves into a lot of politics about the free press and how part of the book is about democracies versus totalitarian regimes, and how totalitarian regimes will control the flow of information, whereas a democracy has a check and balance like the free press that can critique the government, and that is the self-correcting mechanism for democracies. Another example as we get through later in the book that I really resonated with was the dangers of algorithms. And he uses the example of the Facebook Rohingya genocide, where the Facebook users, got really, yes, this is simplifying it, so I apologize, is excited about violence against ethnic minorities. And the reason this came out was because the Facebook algorithm was optimizing for engagement. And the algorithm learned that in order to hit that metric of time on the platform, which social media sites, that's one of the metrics they use, how engaged are users, how active are users, that the best way to do that was by promoting stories and promoting, articles on the platform that incite those reactions. And those that happen to, get the strongest response are ones that are, against kind of ethical standards for most of the world, that, we shouldn't be, promoting violence against ethnic minorities as an example that they use in the genocide example. And that the algorithm itself was, again, making the decisions of what to promote, and the idea of the algorithm being the editor, which is what got Facebook in trouble, and the social media companies are in trouble, that they're constantly fighting that they're not the editor, it's the algorithm optimizing, but the algorithm is choosing what to show other users, so it is acting as an editor. And again, this ties back to his indirect way of saying that we have to keep the human in the loop. And that's maybe a point I disagreed with a little bit here, and he brings it up, but he chooses one stance, that it's not the humans who program the algorithm who are at fault, it's the algorithm itself. And having a computer science background and working in tech and data, I can see both sides of that yes, it's the algorithm that's deciding what to show the users and how to optimize to fit the target that the humans supplied. So the humans are the ones that told the algorithm optimize for engagement. And so Harari kind of glosses over that there was no governance, or there shouldn't be a governance, and kind of blames AI and shows this as an example of AI run out of control and algorithm gone crazy. But of course, if we know that there is also the human element of humans, and in this case, Facebook, seeing that increased ad revenue, and it's very hard when the number goes up and the revenue goes up because of all this engagements, and not really, I guess, digging deeper or turning a blind eye to what was happening, and not having that human in the loop to control the algorithm and to put more checks and balances here. And this leads to another aspect that, again, ties into some of my recent learnings during my master's program, and that was about black box algorithms. And again, my program was about business analytics, and explained to stakeholders that if you are making recommendations, sometimes it's better to choose a more easily explainable model than a complex black box model, so it allows people to understand the basis for the decisions. So this would be using a deep learning, machine learning technique where there's all these different variables that are kind of jumbled up, and you don't really know or can't easily explain how you got from A to B as a recommendation, versus a more simple algorithm or more simple model, such as a linear regression, which is a straight line between points, which is easy for even a non-technical person to understand that this recommendation of a forecast, for example, is based on a straight line between the points and optimizing the distance for that line. That's how, simple terms, a linear regression. And the example that Harari uses in the book showcases that. It was a court case where a judge was using an algorithm to determine whether someone would reoffend, and then making decisions about a human life based on an algorithm's prediction, and then that person successfully suing for the judge basing this on an algorithm that they couldn't explain what exact factors went into the decision of why they recommended this person not to be released or to have a harsher sentence. So that was interesting, and a very, something that we all should think about, black box and understanding how algorithms work and what they're doing under the hood, especially with things like ChatGPT. When we feed an answer, we really should understand what's going on, what data set it was trained on, and how it's coming to these conclusions. And that leads to another point that he makes about governance and kind of AI ethics, which also Ethan Mollick talks about in Co-Intelligence, that we need to understand the training data and how there can be inherent biases in AI, in generative AI like ChatGPT, because the AI is making these predictions of what word to write next when you chat with it based on its training data. And that by being trained on biased data that, for example, may not represent certain minorities or certain viewpoints, the output is then also trained on that data. So, for example, early ChatGPT was based on all the data on the internet that was free. A lot of it, things like short stories or a lot of posts on forums that are mostly dominated by Western countries, which happen to be predominantly male internet users of a certain age. So again, the training data is on a certain subset of people. So of course, the answers once it goes through that black box are going to be based on what the algorithm was trained on, which is a certain demographic, a certain pattern of speech. So these ideas are, again, more cautionary tales of things that can go wrong. And again, the need for a human in the loop and a human to understand what's going on behind the scenes and to help make intelligent decisions on things like training data and ensuring AI governance and AI ethical concerns like biases. Lastly, as we kind of wrap up this review and go through some of my other favorite points, one thing I wanted to also mention was an idea I thought towards the end. It was on data colonialism. And this comes from his concept of the Silicon Curtain, where, like the Iron Curtain divided countries, the Silicon Curtain is going to be between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to AI technology. So what that means is that basically the divide is growing already so fast between the early adopters, which again are primarily US-based companies that had a head start in AI development, versus people starting now. So he gives an example of Google having a monopoly on data. So if there was a startup that was attempting to start a search engine or start a data project, right now it would be very hard to compete with some of the behemoth tech giants like a Google, which already have such a trove of data collected on everything. They've already indexed the internet at this point. So how can a startup compete on the data side? Yes, they can compete on things like innovation, and there's other, algorithms that are currently working on that problem, but it's just such a hard, gap to bridge to catch up with development. The same can be said with AI models. So the early models, those foundational models, as Malik calls them, like your ChatGPTs, Claude, Llama, and Google's Gemini, the kind of the big, couple models out there, they've already trained on so much data, and it's, again, so costly to train these models that they're so far ahead of startups that are attempting to start their own AI and start with small data sets, and that these large foundational models outperform any smaller new model because it's a data game. And that leads to what I want to mention was data colonialism, which was an interesting concept to think about. And he gets there to this point by talking about how, again, early colonialism was about resources, and he makes the connection that in this new age, data can be a resource. He also talks about things like social credit and, the information being a currency, and he makes the interesting points there. It's definitely worth a think about how, we start with information as currency, that we're the product on social media. That leads to social currency, like the social credit system in China, where you're kind of graded on your actions and how they align with societal values. And then does that lead to, again, an actual digital currency based on your social standing, your social credit? And then data colonialism was similar along those lines, that these foundational models and these kind of superpowers, much like colonial powers in the past, with data is the new currency, they're going to go out to the smaller countries, smaller communities as the next stop for resources, which is data. So they will be, going to and exploiting possibly the smaller countries, smaller, resource poor areas to get their data, which are then fed back to kind of the mothership, the homeland, and in this case will be the big tech companies and the big algorithms. So some to think about and some to kind of, keep in the back of your mind about this data colonialism and the Silicon Curtain between the haves and have-nots. I know, organizations like the UN are already trying to get the world on board, and a need for an AI governance and basically a free access to AI, or AI for all, and how it can help emerging countries more than existing countries and existing superpowers. And that we should all think about, will it create that divide between the haves and have-nots with access to these advanced technologies? Because he mentions that in the wars of the future, AI will be the predator. It's an interesting thing to think about, some of these topics of where AI could go. So that was kind of a quick speed run through some of the concepts and the ideas that I found most interesting. Again, it's a really long book, and that's the main thesis, was the need for a self-correcting mechanism for the future. That's kind of the argument and conclusion he comes to, that before it kind of gets out of control, that we need to always have checks and balances, and we need to understand what's happening. Like Malik mentions, the human in the loop, that we really need to have a control over these algorithms before they become kind of spiraled out of control and start making their own decisions. He does the doom and gloom of how it can influence politics in areas like totalitarian governments, where there is that central point of government, by influencing that through an algorithm that, for example, just like how the Facebook algorithm or the YouTube algorithm optimizes for the views, and we, as YouTube people complain about being a slave to the algorithm, are we training the algorithm because it's discovered something about us, that humans like violence and they like making inflammatory comments? Did it discover something, or is the algorithm training us? Is it influencing us to act a certain way? And this leads to the government thing, that if there is a central point of decision making in these centralized governments, and then the AI of the future can influence that somehow without even sort of the person or the organization being aware of that, they can influence the world, influence these governments, influence organizations. So a lot to think about, and this is definitely a more dim and gloom, bleak outlook on AI, and more of a warning. And Harari addresses that early in the book as well, that all of the consumer companies are extolling the virtues of AI and the good of AI. So his kind of reason for writing the book is to be that counterpoint, that this is, it might not be as rosy, and there is a dark side to AI that we should be aware of. So in conclusion, I would say this was maybe a 4 out of 5 for me as a book in general, because it did give me a lot to think about. I did enjoy the concepts of network theory, which I enjoyed as a class, that talks about AI, and it does link together the story of transmitting information, the flow of information, and how AI will affect that flow and change the flow of information in the future. So all in all, it was still a good book. I see why it was on so many recommend to read lists. It was a little bit bleak and not as optimistic. I feel like I need a palate cleanse after this and a couple other books that are a little more dystopian in nature. I need to find a more optimistic book like Co-Intelligence was. It was very optimistic of how we can work and live and work with AI for positive, data for good, AI for good. So still worth a read to be an informed citizen and to understand what is happening in the world with AI. So that was my review, my long-winded review and thoughts on Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus. So thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed the video.